Good morning. Welcome to this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. Please advance the slide forward. Thank you. Today, we have Misty Peterson and Jillian Simmons from King & Spalding here with us to talk about data governance for nonprofits, advancing trust, compliance, and impact. Before Misty and Jillian jump into the substance of today's conversation, I want to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about PBPA if you're not aware of our mission. What PBPA does is we provide legal assistance to nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We do this with our network of amazing attorneys like Jillian and Misty, who work at law firms and in-house throughout Atlanta and Georgia. Next slide, please. PBPA serves clients directly, and our clients are 501c3s that are located in the greater Atlanta area and whose mission is to serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. And our clients are otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you're interested in applying to be a client, please visit our website and you can fill out a legal assistance request form there. We also have a wealth of resources available on our website for free to any organization who's interested. And these are specifically focused content for Georgia nonprofits. At our resource center, we include articles, past webcasts, podcasts, and we do have in-person events a couple times a year. So feel free to go to our website or events page to get more information about those items coming up soon. And a quick disclaimer, we are attorneys after all. Please keep in mind that today's information is just general guidance. It is not specific legal advice for your nonprofit. So if you have specific questions, please reach out directly to an attorney to talk about your specific situation. During the course of today's webcast, Jillian and Misty will be open to answering some questions, but we do ask you to keep those questions pretty general and do not disclose any confidential or privileged information through the questions. And now I would like to say thank you to Jillian and Misty for being here today to talk to us about governance, data governance. A little bit of background on Jillian. She regularly counsels clients, including boards and senior executives, on data privacy and security compliance, cybersecurity preparedness, and data breach response. Misty Peterson is also at King & Spalding, where she serves in their data privacy, security, and class action practices. She handles complex litigation and guides clients through compliance and cybersecurity incident responses. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for that warm welcome. So here we have very quickly our agenda for this chat. We will start with an overview of data privacy responsibilities and what those risks are. We will then move into a brief overview of some of the more relevant laws, regulations, and guidance at both the federal level as well as here in Georgia. We will then spend a little bit of time introducing the different cyber threats that you should be aware of for your organizations. And then a subset of that are additional risks that are specific to using online marketing and advertising tools, as well as some of the new AI-enabled apps and other software. We will lastly dive into some risk management preventative measures, which is where we will probably spend the bulk of our time. So why are we talking about data privacy responsibilities today? As nonprofits, in consideration of the missions that you carry, you may collect, store, or otherwise use a lot of information that could be deemed sensitive in nature And by sensitive, we're referring to individuals. And this could be specific to the beneficiaries, especially if you have a mission that's focused on those who might have been a victim or survivor of certain traumas or other vulnerable populations. It could also be that you have a lot of financial information from your donors. And this could especially be harmful to them if such information gets leaked or exfiltrated to a threat actor who might use it against the donor. So we also understand, given your mission, that you have limited resources. Some of you may have specific budgetary limits on any overhead expenditures. They might be limited to a certain percentage of your funding sources even. And so this means that when you're looking across the many things in which you have to spend on, this might feel as just one more thing to create a line item for. So given the potential sensitivity of the information and the limited resources that are available, that creates some inherent risk to your organization, to the data that you hold and the processes that you have in place. We have here in the middle bucket under inherent risk, just a few stats on small organizations, medium-sized organizations. And I will call out the third bullet there that says less than 50% of small entities have an information security plan in place. And I'm calling that one out because that might be an unusual term or an unfamiliar term. And we'll talk to that when we talk about risk measures in the latter part of this webinar. So then we want to say that as you try to mitigate these risks, again, any measures that you undertake will go a long way towards building and maintaining trust between you and the individuals whose information you hold, again, whether that be beneficiaries or donors or other third parties that you might partner with. And transparency will go a long way towards building that trust. So you will hear repeated emphasis on disclosure throughout our presentation today. Misty, would you like to add anything?
No, I just wanted to point out, thank you, Jillian, that statistic in the middle of the page that 67% of small and medium-sized entities in the US were the victims of a cyber attack 5 years ago in 2018. So that even in those time periods was 2 out of 3 small and medium-sized entities. So it's a really striking statistic, and I would be interested seeing as we have progressed in the sophistication of threat actors, whether that statistic has even changed. That would be something interesting for us to think about now 5 years later.
Yes, and the FBI has a unit, their IC3 unit, and they issue an annual report. They've stopped breaking it down by business size, but even there you will see that it's an even greater percentage that experience some type of attack or breach or unauthorized disclosure. And that's across any and all organizations that have reported some type of cyber attack or privacy-related issue to the FBI. So unfortunately, it does continue to grow. So next, as I noted earlier, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about just a few of the key laws and regulations and guidance, again, at the federal level, which is across the United States, and then here at the state level, specifically in Georgia. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about the 6 that you see here on the screen. But again, we want to call out that there are many laws, regulations, and guidance that can go far beyond this that we're not touching on today. And certainly if you collect information and share information outside of the United States or even with other states, If you sell certain things in furtherance perhaps of your funding sources that are, again, targeting folks outside of the US, this could, again, bring in additional laws and guidance that you should be aware of. If you build any applications to promote your organization, that brings in a whole host of other guidance. So again, these are just some of the more foundational elements that we want to call out.
And we should also mention here too, Jillian, that it didn't make it onto this slide, and we'll talk about these issues a little more later in the broadcast. But of course, the IRS and the Georgia Nonprofit Code have requirements on Georgia nonprofits as well. In particular, the IRS has in its Form 990 a question that pertains to whether the organization has a document retention policy. And the Georgia Nonprofit Code, of course, requires certain records to be kept either permanently or for a certain amount of time. And there's an interesting tension between the document retention requirements that are on the nonprofit and other types of corporations and the desire to minimize the data that one holds that might be sensitive because the more data you have, and if you experience an attack or some sort of intrusion, then you put yourself at higher risk for that data to be exfiltrated and used for a nefarious means. So there's a real tension there between the data privacy laws and the document retention requirements that exist for nonprofit organizations. And we'll talk about more of that later, but I just wanted to flag that for the group.
Yes, thank you, Missy. That's a great point to call out. And we, as Misty noted, later on, we will go a bit more into what retention versus disposal requirements or measures you should consider. So again, just looking at the 6 that we have here on the screen, we can start with at the top there, the Georgia breach notice law. And this has been in effect since 2005, so you may already be familiar with it. It requires you to notify individuals if you experience a system security breach that has somehow compromised the security, confidentiality, or integrity of an individual's personal information. And here in Georgia, that's defined as like your social security number, license, a bank account number or a payment card number with some type of passcode that would allow for access. If it may also be some other type of account username and password or PIN or other types of access codes, again, that would allow for a threat actor or an unauthorized user to have access. And then Georgia has a bit of a catch-all where, it says if any of those items, are not combined with the person's name, but it would still allow their identity to be compromised, then you would still have a requirement to notify those individuals.
There is one really interesting quirk about the data breach notification law in Georgia, though it by its terms applies to information brokers and data collectors. So it's heavily fact specific as to whether an entity might qualify as an information broker or a data collector, but broadly speaking, an information broker would be one that assembles data concerning individuals and repackages it, either sells or shares that information with a third party for some reason, or a data collector is generally considered to be a governmental type entity. So it would be, if you experience some sort of incident, it would be extremely prudent to consult with an attorney on what, if any, obligations you might have under the Georgia data breach notification law.
Yes, absolutely. So skipping down a bit to the Georgia Fair Business and Practices Act. So this prohibits unfair and deceptive acts or practices in the marketplace. There are a lot of specific examples on what might be considered deceptive as far as an act or a practice goes. We can call out a few, but I think one of the first ones is about making false or misleading statements about another business or your product or your service. And so if you do maintain a website, if you maintain social media, if you do news segments, promoting your organization, emails that you may, newsletters that you may send out, you do want to make sure that you're very clear about what you're doing and what you're not doing. And a little bit later, we'll even go into, when you have a privacy policy or any statements regarding how you treat people's information, any promises that you make, any assertions that you make, you want to be very careful that you are accurately describing such practices regarding data. Misty, did you want to add anything to that one as well?
No, I think you covered that very well. Thanks, Jillian.
Okay, great. So with that, the Georgia Charitable Solicitations Act, and this is in place to ensure that charities that are operating in Georgia are abiding by certain standards, including the ones that were set out in the Fair Business Practices Act that we just talked about. There are a few disclosure requirements here. And again, as we mentioned, this is going to be a common theme to make sure that what you're disclosing and what you're stating is accurate and truthful. And so they have two disclosure requirements I wanted to call out. And so the first one is that, at the time of a solicitation, that you disclose the name and location of any solicitor agent that might be used, or the organization, and that you provide a full description of the charitable program and let folks know that a financial statement can be available for review upon request. And again, this is to further build trust and transparency. And then the second one, which Misty touched on a bit, is the financial disclosures. Understanding the IRS Form 990 has to be filed, and that you have the proper criteria met for your financial statements for the prior 2 years. Now, of course, the Charitable Solicitations Act does have some exceptions, such as certain educational organizations, fire and rescue, some other public good type exceptions. But again, there are several disclosure requirements that we would encourage you to be mindful of. Misty, any other thoughts there?
No, you covered that as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. So similar to that, we wanted to just briefly touch on the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission Act. They have Section 5, which allows the FTC to have jurisdiction over any unfair and deceptive practices, similar to what we just talked about with Georgia. And typically, they don't have jurisdiction over most nonprofit organizations that are 501c3 organizations, but they do have it over trade associations, some professional societies, and then certain industry groups and their constituents. And so it typically would not have jurisdiction, but we do want to call that out here. So similarly, at the federal level, we have COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And for those of you who have a mission that might be oriented towards minors, this might be something that you're more familiar with, or if you have children, you might personally otherwise be familiar with this. But this is aimed at regulating websites or any other online services that are considered commercial in nature, but that are directed at children. And by children, this is referring to those who are under 13. And so again, this may not be directly relevant to all of you, But this is another situation where the FTC may have jurisdiction. And so there's been a Supreme Court ruling that COPPA would apply as well to certain nonprofit organizations. And so again, this, to Misty's earlier point, if you have any concerns here, we certainly recommend that you speak with an attorney to understand if this applies to you, because if so, then there must be certain things that you have, particularly if you have a website, again, things like a privacy policy, consent from a parent or a guardian, and some other additional requirements. And then the last thing down at the very bottom, and we kind of saved this for last, is because you see that there's a Georgia privacy bill and it says proposed. So this is the Georgia Computer Data Privacy Act. It's still a bill. It was introduced in February 2022, and it was sent to the Committee on Science and Technology. So there hasn't been much traction here. And it likely in that state as written wouldn't apply to most folks here, because this is generally geared towards an entity that has annual revenue of over 50 million. But we wanted to call it out because since that time, we've seen a trend in other state laws where they are actually making that threshold much lower, or there might not even be a gross revenue requirement at all. And then certainly some states have explicitly called out that nonprofit organizations are not an exception. So we just wanted to flag this here because we're seeing a trend that state comprehensive data privacy laws include a much broader swath of organizations, entities, and companies than we did even a year ago.
Right. Colorado is one of those states, Jillian, that has explicitly denied exemption for nonprofits, that while they still have to meet that certain dollar threshold in Colorado, they would not be ordinarily exempt simply because they're a nonprofit. So while that's probably a minority view among the states that have passed privacy bills over the last 2 or 3 years, it's still a concerning trend and something to pay attention to, especially if you're a large nonprofit that operates in multiple states.
Yeah, absolutely. So next, we just wanted to briefly cover some of the more common cyber threats to organizations. And this includes, again, small and medium size, as well as nonprofit organizations. And we bucketed them kind of in 4 ways. So at the top left, you see data exfiltration. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is when you either have private or confidential, sensitive, or otherwise information that you own, or that you are a steward of, when this has been disclosed without authorization. And that could mean something like a breach where it's leaving your organization. In some instances, it could also be just the unauthorized disclosure within your organization. So perhaps only certain people are supposed to have access to certain information, and someone inadvertently emails it to another member of your team where they shouldn't have, and it wasn't password protected or encrypted. And so data exfiltration, it could have a few different terms. Looking right below that, something that you've probably also seen a lot of, hopefully haven't experienced, but you'll see there ransoms, extortions, and threats. And when we're talking about ransoms, typically that's referring to ransomware, which is a specific type of malware that would be on a system or even an individual device like a laptop, where the person is locked out, and unless they pay a certain amount of money, they won't have access again. And of course, there's no way to know for certain whether or not, even if you pay the ransom, if you'll get access. But That's generally what ransomware is. Extortions there might be a threat to leak information, especially damaging information or information that would cause reputational harm to an individual. Typically, these are your directors or, on the corporate side, your C-suite. So very high level folks, certainly public facing folks are often the ones being targeted for an extortion. If you don't pay, I will leak this information. That would, again, cause embarrassment or reputational harm. And then similar to that are threats of physical harm. And it could also be a threat to disrupt an event as well. So not just a threat of physical harm, but it could be that, hey, we know you have this big annual event coming up, and if you don't pay, we're going to sabotage it. Going across there over on the top right, you'll see disruptions to operations. If you've heard of a DDoS or just a DOS attack, which is a denial of service or distributed denial of service when it's even a large scale attack there. And that's essentially to flood your system, typically a website, so that it crashes or that it's otherwise inoperable. It could also be defacement. If you've ever heard of a hacktivist, it's like a hacker / activist who cares very deeply and has taken a position on an issue, usually typically a controversial issue. And so generally the targets of defacement activities are typically government entities, but they also target private sector organizations. And so this is where they have hacked into your website and they have defaced it to either say the name of their group or the name of the actor, or they will put up their own message, maybe that they want to give to the public to try to draw attention to their position on an issue. And then lastly, there at the bottom where you see system and network attacks, that's a bit of a bucket, a catch-all bucket there. But that could be any number of things, from someone exploiting a vulnerability again, it could be your device, it could be your phone. It could be someone trying to use your multi-factor authentication token. If you use that, it could be someone trying to just brute force attack your password. It could be a variety of things. And certainly, we don't want you to think that these attacks happen so cleanly categorized, such as this. You will commonly see that someone used an attack that you might see here under section 4 in order to exfiltrate data. And maybe they've also decided to hold the system ransom. And so, so now you're seeing all 3 categories here folded into one kind of big attack or operation against your organization.
Jillian, I just wanted to go back for just a moment to data exfiltration and just share, there are a couple of things that we see a lot. One is, and I think we're all familiar with scam emails, phishing emails, where you get a suspicious email and it might have a link that they want you to click, or they may try to spoof it and make it look like it's a legitimate email from your organization. And that's risky potentially in 2 ways. Number one, it could cause some reputational risk if someone's posing as a person in your organization and say soliciting money or things like that. It could also, though, if someone receives that email and clicks on it, then it might give access to your system or to the recipient's system, and that could cause the bad actor to be able to get into the system and look at the data that's in the system. And then to go back to what Jillian said about the inadvertent email that an employee may have sent. Sometimes it might be argued that there's a good faith exception where the person is a legitimate employee or volunteer of the organization, inadvertently sent the information to perhaps another trusted partner, either within the organization or even outside the organization, and the person who receives it confirms that they've deleted it, they're not going to do anything else with it, that there may be some arguments that that might not constitute a data breach as we think of it. So there are just, again, highly fact-specific scenarios here with respect to cyber threats.
Yeah, thank you for adding that additional color. And to the point about the scams and spoofing, it helps to have in place a set of processes for anyone that you solicit money from or anyone that you make payments to. And that way, if you ever receive, or if any of your donors ever receive new instructions that say, hey, we've updated our bank account, please send future donations here or there. Or if you receive instructions that say, hey, please make your payments through this new link instead, on something that otherwise looks legit. If you have that established process in place, then folks will know, hey, we probably should coordinate and hop on a call. And certainly never call the phone number that's listed in the email, call a phone number that they know to be true. So we just wanted to spend a quick minute talking about using online marketing and advertising tools and AI apps. And we called this off as a separate kind of risk bucket that proposes threats to your organization, because this is a new and evolving space. And you might use certain tools just to help with your day-to-day operations. On the AI app side, OpenAI, Pictory, Bubble, TinyWow, Midjourney, Bard, of course, everyone knows ChatGPT, especially version 4 that came out this spring. And so with those, they carry their own types of threats, in addition to the first two, which we can kind of put together, and that would be web beacons, which use pixels, but then we've spun out separately third-party pixels. And so just a little bit of information for those who may not necessarily be familiar with them. A web beacon works similarly to cookies, which has been around for so long. I'm sure folks are familiar with that. They certainly probably always get the pop-up saying, do you want to accept all, some, or none? And so then this just becomes a bit of code that's embedded into typically a website, although it could be an app, it could also be an email. And that allows for the person who's embedded the code to track movement. And so if it's referring to a website, it could be, how many folks clicked on which pages and how long did they spend on certain pages within your website. You could also have it triggered so that if someone does something such as create an account, that it triggers an event that you get a notification for. So there's lots of different use cases for it. Again, it all relates to tracking movement. And it's also, similarly, if you're looking at web-enabled emails, such as, how many people actually opened your email? Did they forward it, or did they just delete it without even opening it? And so you might be using these tools already and not necessarily calling it by these names. And then we want to call out third-party pixels specifically, because these are when you have pixels, which we again said could be used in web beacons, but these are when you send that information typically directly back to a third party. And normally those are tools, advertising or search engine optimization, SEO tools that are provided by lots of different companies, small and large. I mean, even, Google, Meta, even the large companies have different types of tools. And again, they could be used for many different purposes. And so we wanted to call these out because Again, there's a risk of sending this information to third parties if you haven't disclosed that to the person that is, clicking around through your site or your app or through your email. And so again, we want to go back to this, kind of fundamental tenet of providing disclosure so that you cannot be found that you have misrepresented your use of data or even your just collection of data in the first place. And then looking over here again to the AI-enabled tools, there's not a lot that's known about the development of a lot of these tools. I mean, certainly ChatGPT is front and center. Of course, Bard is front and center, perhaps even Midjourney and OpenAI. But for some of these others, which seem to be popping up daily, we cannot confirm, how much security is built into those apps, what that development lifecycle looks like. Are they secured? Are all vulnerabilities patched? What are they doing with the data? And so by uploading any sensitive information, and again, that in this instance doesn't even necessarily need to be specific to an individual, but to your organization, it's hard to then guarantee that that information is being safeguarded. And we certainly wouldn't want to cause an unnecessary risk of a breach or identity theft, or even a malicious use of information that could contribute to the rising issue of deep fakes. I think perhaps we've seen in the news a few times, or at least I have, where voices are being spoofed and being used to call in and act as people to bypass certain access controls that you might have in place for someone's bank. So those are just some of the risks that using these tools can also cause to the organization. Misty, did you have any thoughts here as well that you wanted to add?
Just to sum up, if you are not sure what information your website is capturing or any of these applications, it's definitely worth having a conversation with your IT team as well as your marketing team, if you have one, just to understand what information may be gathered and what you're retaining it and how.
Yes. So moving on to the preventative measures to help with managing and mitigating risk, we put together some best practices for cyber hygiene and privacy hygiene, and we'll just go down them one by one. But just to give a quick overview here, you'll see, again, privacy policy in terms of use, that's clear, easy to read. Again, going back to the tenet of transparency. If you have BYOD, bring your own device, you want to think about the access and authentication controls that are in place, and we'll provide a few examples. Keeping with BYOD, again, encryption, if you have especially sensitive data, which we talked about earlier, could be specific to your organization. It could be specific to beneficiaries or donors. Clear procedures for data retention and secure disposal of data, which Misty touched on earlier, and we're going to circle back to. Onboarding training, not everyone's favorite thing to do, but it's certainly necessary. Clear procedures for termination when someone leaves your organization, and then what do you do with that data and devices? And we'll think about that from both an electronic data perspective as well as hard copy, paper copies that you may have, given the remote and hybrid style of work that most of us have now. Prep for incident response and a call list for incident response. And we won't spend too much time there. And along the way, we'll also point out some resources that will go into more detail on each of these. So firstly, the privacy policy and terms of use. Again, you want to describe what data is being collected, how it's being used, and how you are storing it. In some instances, it may be good to disclose how long it's being stored. And this gets to Misty's point about if there are any regulatory requirements. And that says you must retain data for a minimum period of time, it may be helpful to disclose that there. And certainly if it's being shared with any third parties, and this also goes back to the earlier point about pixels, third-party pixels that you may have enabled that you may want to talk to your IT or marketing folks about. And then there are some additional resources. There was a webinar and other guidance located at the link here. And there will be a copy of these slides. So if you don't get to copy down all of these URLs, no worries. Next is the first of the BYODs. And again, this is about access and authentication. So think about where are your crown jewels of data, so to speak, where's the most sensitive data, and try to be thoughtful about who actually needs this. And what is your legitimate business need, as we like to call it, for holding on to this data and for how long. And so therefore that also factors into who needs to have this type of data. Everyone is fairly aware of what a strong password looks like these days, and that it should be changed regularly. I know that that could be hard to enforce, particularly on mobile devices. If you're not using a mobile device management software tool, but certainly you can ask your employees at certain periodicity points to please update their passwords if this is not something that you can directly control. And down there at the bottom, we see multi-factor authentication, which can take many different forms. But those are just a few examples of some safeguards to have in place.
And just to add to the password point, that passwords shouldn't be reused across multiple sites, because if someone is able to be breached in one avenue, then if they're using the same password, then that would be easily discoverable by someone who had an ill intent.
Absolutely. It's great advice. So again, keeping on bring your own device, encryption for sensitive data. And you may be using like a USB thumb drive. You may have cloud storage, especially for folks that use Google for communication and storage purposes. You can still ensure that anything that, again, is especially sensitive, that you've placed additional controls around it. And if you have devices that you pass out, such as laptops, things that you would have an IT team for, then you would want to make sure that you've enabled as a standard baseline configuration encryption on those devices. Anything else that you wanted to add, Misty?
No, I think we can move on.
Yep. So here we're circling back to data retention and secure disposal. And again, we want to think about this in two ways. We have our electronic data, and then we have our hard copy data. So thinking about it from an electronic data perspective, you want to avoid maintaining any type of software or applications that you're not using. And we also called out here, social media accounts that you're not using as well. Being thoughtful about, again, what you are required to maintain and what you functionally need to retain and for how long. But otherwise, we would advise, if you're not using something, to close those accounts, remove that software. This opens up, more vectors of vulnerability for someone to be able to exploit any gaps, any weaknesses, and to be able to cause some type of disruption or harm to your organization, similar to the different types of cyber threats that we outlined earlier. Misty, did you want to add here?
Sure. So, and I know we've talked a lot about electronic issues, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that paper is very important to keep secure as well, particularly in the environment we find ourselves in now, where many of us may be working hybrid or maybe working completely remotely. Our staffers leaving papers with sensitive information on their desks? Are things locked up in a cabinet or somewhere, or a room that's secure? Who has keys to those cabinets or doors, if anyone? And so that would be part of your data governance idea, is to make sure that not only electronic, but also your paper communications are safe.
Exactly. And if you happen to maintain anyone's medical or health related information, then there would be additional safeguards that you must abide by, whether it's paper or electronic copy. And that also gets to Misty's point, thinking about physical safeguards that you can have in place, where you have locked doors, locked cabinets. Only certain people have access to certain spaces with the most sensitive types of information. Using cover sheets if you leave things on your desk. So there are additional safeguards that you want to think about, particularly if you're dealing with sensitive information or protected health information. Onboarding and training. Again, it's always good to have this when someone first comes on board. I know they're typically bombarded with a ton of trainings, whether it's specific to the role or just kind of getting indoctrinated to the organization itself. But this is something that you certainly want to maintain. And again, depending on what type of information that person will have access to, it may even be required. It may also be required that they have to then conduct annual training again on how to keep that type of sensitive information safe. And so because this is unfortunately a constantly evolving threatscape, the training, it's good practice generally to continue to have that refreshed for all of your staff that comes in contact with any of your information, even if not necessarily required. Misty, did you have anything to add here?
No, I mean, that's a good point about refresher training. Even after onboarding, we need to be reminded of being cognizant of these issues and making sure that we don't get lax in respond, or maybe we're going too quickly and we respond to an email without thinking through whether it's legitimate and things like that. So refresher training is also very important.
Yes, and especially kind of what Misty spoke on earlier about marketing or IT teams that might have introduced new tools that collect new information, new or atypical information. So you would want to make sure that folks in those types of roles are doing, again, specific training for that role, which might be different than everyone else on the team. So it's helpful to think about what information is being collected, accessed, or retained by which team members. Here we have termination, and again, what to do with your data and devices. And so this is where Misty was alluding to earlier about a tension between, wanting to minimize data, again, thinking about less harm that is possible to do to organizations and individuals versus actual requirements. Misty, did you want to provide a little bit more detail?
Just that, of course, the Georgia Nonprofit Corporation Code requires that certain records be permanently retained, for example, board meeting minutes and things like that. But then also there are certain, as the slide indicates, some records should be disposed of when they have reached the end of their lifespan, and that needs to be done securely. For example, shredding, confirming that information has been disposed of. If there are copies of it, ensuring that all copies have been gathered. It might be helpful to have a log of when records were created, and you can track how long they've been in existence and when they should be destroyed, and then noting down, for example, when they are destroyed, so that there's a clear paper trail, if you will, of the record retention requirements so that they're being met.
Yes, thank you. And if you're unable to, immediately shred these types of records, if they're print, or if you're unable to permanently erase them if they're electronic, another option set out under the statute is to modify the records so that the personal information is unreadable. And there are certain tools that allow you, for example, to completely black out, irreversibly black out certain information in a document. So that could be an option as well. And again, this is, specific to a person's individual information. So it's somewhat of the same information, personal information that we covered earlier under the breach notice law. So again, their social security number, license, or other personal identification card. We've also talked about, how sensitive person's medical or dental information is. This would also be covered, photographs, fingerprints, all those types of things. Those are the types of things that you would want to have a very permanent and clear disposal of, and a process to support that. So the last two little safeguard measures that we're recommending here are both related to incident response. And again, we have resources here that will go into a deep dive on this. And so we have a checklist, training, so that folks understand what they need to do if they think that there has been an incident. And again, this could be as simple as, hey, this email seems peculiar, or someone told me that they received an email from me that I never sent to them. So even things that might seem small, or you might think that perhaps you're confused, it's certainly worth raising. And so this is where it's good to have training across the board so that everyone knows what to recognize and when to, raise a flag saying, hey, this is really unusual. And then with that, we recommend you having a call list so that if you unfortunately do experience an incident, that you have at your ready the contact information of who you can immediately call, because this could be an unfortunate situation where you're locked out of everything. It could be you're locked out of your laptop or home computer. It could be you're locked out of your cell phone. It could be that everyone is locked out of the entire email apparatus, the entire network. So if you have a handy call list that, multiple copies of that multiple folks have, so in the instance of an incident, who you can call, and that is your legal counsel. If you have IT support, if you have some key stakeholders, be it partners, donors, beneficiaries, government liaisons that you need to contact and notify, that you have that list handy, and so that the incident itself won't stop you from being able to start your remediation process.
And it may be an obvious point, but even if you're not locked out of your system, but you think someone may have access to emails that shouldn't have access, you might not want to send email communications to individuals because that person might be able to intercept them. So having what we call an out-of-band communication, i.e. by telephone, or by text or something where we don't think that the nefarious or person with a bad intent has access to that is always advisable, because you don't want to give that person the playbook to exactly what you're doing, and you don't want them to necessarily try to cover up their traces and evict themselves from the system before you've had an opportunity to take a look and see if there is an incident going on, because if there is, then there would be other steps that you would take in the incident response process.
Absolutely. And thank you, Misty. And that concludes it for us. So please let us know if there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Misty and Jillian, for all that very helpful and sometimes scary information, but it was all great advice. One question that I have, and Misty, you had alluded to this when you mentioned paper documents and how some offices are now more hybrid or more remote than they were pre-2020. I know there's some of our clients who have asked us about situations where they still technically have an office space and they have a bunch of records there still, but there aren't employees there on a regular basis. And they're just, do you guys have any guidance for them, for these organizations that still have a bunch of records, still have paper documents at an office that is sometimes being, people there, sometimes no people there? Any thoughts?
Well, I think it probably depends on the size of the organization and how many offices and what the accessibility is to that building. But it might be advisable for that employee to, when they have an opportunity, to go back in and check their office to see if there is any such information, and if so, to securely dispose of it or make sure that it's locked away. Or if there's a trusted member of the organization that could do that on behalf of that person, then that might be advisable. But simply, at this point, if we haven't used the paper and it's not something that that we're required to keep under the law, either the IRS regulations or the Georgia Code, we might not need it anymore unless we're required to retain it. So it would just be a good practice to review those documents in a trusted fashion, dispose of anything that is no longer required to keep, and to make sure that anything that is required to keep is securely fastened. Jillian, any other thoughts?
No, I think you summarized it well.
Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or Q&A, but I'm seeing lots of thank yous, lots of very helpful information, good advice. So I think that's it, that it's a wrap. But Misty and Jillian, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insight with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you. This was great. Hopefully it's been helpful, and encourage everyone to review the slides. Again, we embedded links to lots of other good resources that the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta already has available, other webinars, other thought papers. So hopefully this should help folks have a well-rounded governance and risk mitigation program.
Definitely. And for any nonprofits who are interested in hearing about some of our upcoming webcasts, we do have one next week, very relevant to probably all of the members of our audience, related to recent updates to the Nonprofit Code of Georgia. So that presentation will be on the 23rd, Wednesday the 23rd. So if you go to our Eventbrite page, you can sign up for that. Thanks, everyone.